Amen. We finished out by considering the number 30. As it relates to the life of Christ in its three separate phases, overlaid over the life of the movement. And we can see that it takes us to not just a year, but a day. November 9, 2019. These are our prophetic numbers that we've been using, juggling in this movement. But we understand from the principle of the 25-20 that there's something you can do with prophetic numbers. One of those 25-20s can be halved, and right in the middle also becomes a waymark. It becomes two periods of the 1260. 1260 years and 1260 years. This second 1260 the Adventist Church has no problem with, but combined they do not prefer. In the midpoint, 538 AD to 1798, the 1260 years. So you can take a prophetic number and halve it down the middle. And in understanding 2014, that was one thing that has also been done, is taking that 126, a symbol of the 25-20, another 25-20, and halving it down the middle. So if you can halve the 25-20 and find a waymark in the middle, you can halve a 126 and a 151. So if we do that, we halve the 126, takes us to 1956. That's 63 years. And I will mark the halves. 63 years. I'd ask us to go back in our minds to our study last night, where we covered much of the history, not much of it, but enough to understand the relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, and how warfare looks like in our time, how World War III looks like in our time, what we know as an information war. And we introduced the idea of information based online cyber warfare. We also considered us 1989 as Daniel 11 verse 40 and as a battle, and how we imagine that, how that looks like to us. And then we also considered 2016 as a battle and how that looks to us. If we can keep those things in our minds, I would suggest 1956 has a lot to tell us about the Battle of Raphia. Back in World War II, our Alpha history, who is the King of the South? Joseph Stalin. Stalin and the USSR is the King of the South. Italy united with Hitler in fascism as united with the King of the North. But Joseph Stalin embodied the King of the South. (1956) was a few years after the death of Joseph Stalin, and we understood that in 1929 he set up this cult of personality, and we also discussed what a cult of personality was last night, and how Donald Trump was setting up a cult of personality. That cult of personality extended after his death to where he was looked upon as not quite deified, but just about in that same kind of line of thought, as the hero of the people. Joseph Stalin's cult of personality ended in 1956. This was, I will fit it if I can, Khrushchev. Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union. It was Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev. Khrushchev's midnight speech. It's known as Khrushchev's midnight speech. It was the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Nikita Khrushchev gathered all of them together late at night to deliver a report he had written on the cult of personality and its consequences. The report was titled "The Cult of Personality and Its Consequences." And what he did over the hours of midnight in that speech was a total takedown of Joseph Stalin. Only 3 years after the death of Stalin, who'd been mourned by the great majority of Soviet citizens who saw him as a divine father. So soon afterwards, here was their new leader, Khrushchev, telling them that they had made a cataclysmic error. Far from divine, Stalin was satanic. The leaders who inherited the party from Stalin agreed that Khrushchev should make the speech only after months of arguing, and subject to the compromise that this speech was never to be published. It was never to be in written form. He delivers this midnight speech, and what he does is lay out the crimes of Stalin. Someone came up to me last night asking why Vladimir Putin couldn't be put in jail, because his crimes are so obvious and profound, horrific. And what this midnight speech did was lay out the crimes of Stalin. It said that this speech shook the Soviet Union to its very core, but even more so its communist allies, China, etc. Forces were and in Central Europe. Forces were unleashed that eventually changed the course of history. From 1956, you can see the Soviet Union is going to go down. It's a waymark on the fall of the Soviet Union. But at the time, the impact on the delegates was more immediate. The members of the Communist Party who heard this speech and heard what Stalin had really done, and I know a few people in history who have had more horrific practices than Joseph Stalin, the tens of millions of people that he had killed through starvation, through Siberian exiled camps. He was someone who you would have to think had a type of mental illness. When Joseph Stalin's son tried to commit suicide and shoot himself and failed, the first thing Stalin said was that he had a stupid child who could not shoot straight even to shoot himself. When his other son was captured by the Germans in World War II, the Germans tried to swap him, to give him back to Stalin in a prisoner exchange. Joseph Stalin said his son had failed him by being captured and would not take him back off the Germans. His son died in a Nazi concentration camp a few years later. And his daughter ended up fleeing the Soviet Union, cutting ties with her family. His wife committed suicide after years of abuse. This was his own family, let alone what he did to his enemies. And when Stalin was made known as a tyrant, a murderer, and a torturer of even his own Communist Party members, those communist leaders that heard that speech in that night were horrified. It led to many of them, after 6 weeks, not one of those communist leaders showed their face at a diplomatic function. When they did reappear and when those leaders were seen again, they looked haggard and older. Many of them fled during this speech to the bathrooms to throw up. Some later committed suicide when they learnt of what had happened. Although let it be noted that to do what Stalin did, he also had many members of his party who were complicit and aware, including Khrushchev himself. This was a tactical move by the new leader to remove an old cult of personality that was Stalin's, so that he could bring in his own and be more legitimate in the eyes of the people. This midnight speech made a very big impact on one young man who was at that time a university student in Moscow. This speech had a big impact on a man known as Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev. In university at that time, it made a big impact. And Gorbachev was really the cause of the breakdown of the Soviet Union in 1991. He led his own country into that breakup. The speech was never to be printed, but it was leaked to the West through Poland, through Israeli intelligence, and then passed on to the CIA. The CIA passed it on to the New York Times, who published the whole speech in full. In the effort to publish it, they cut almost everything out of the newspaper. The New York Times newspaper was pretty much just this speech. They even cut 7 pages of advertisements. They cut out their own income so they could get this speech into the hands of the people. Still, it sold out and they had to print more papers. This Krishnev's midnight speech was not published in the Soviet Union until 1989. So when we consider what happened that night, whose crimes are laid open in 1956? Stalin's. And Stalin and Putin are prophetically the same man, both kings of the South. So whose crimes are laid open in 2019? Vladimir Putin. And what crimes has he been doing? I would suggest this relates to specific crimes. We shouldn't be shocked when we hear of what has been happening. That's already in the public record, the many people that Vladimir Putin has had killed and how he established his dictatorship and the corruption within the Russian government. But one thing that he has been doing in secret is collecting information on Donald Trump. What year did Russia begin collecting information on Donald Trump? 1979. So by the time you get to 2019, you've had 40 years of Russia working on Donald Trump on what they call compromat, blackmail material. That's been done in secret. And if we consider that raffia is an information war, when Donald Trump is weakened by an attack by the King of the South relating to information, I would suggest that the crimes that are laid open of Vladimir Putin has something to do with the information that he's been gathering on Donald Trump. 40 years worth of blackmail material. And if we want to consider what some of that blackmail material looks like, one of the practices of the Soviet Union, you see, they thought long term. The Soviet Union thought long term in the Cold War. The way they fight war has never been short term. They've looked decades into the future. So what the Soviet Union would do is they would invite, for one example, they set up a hotel in a country that had no modern resources. It was a Russian hotel in the middle of this little country down in Asia. And because it was a fancy hotel in the middle of a country that didn't have fancy hotels, all the Western politicians would go there. But it was a Russian hotel and they didn't know that, which is why all the rooms were bugged and there was a video in every bedroom. What they would do is that if you were a nobody, let's say I'm an American citizen and my parents are wealthy, and I'm 18 years old, I just finished school, and I get to go on holiday to Russia. If I go and stay at a Russian hotel, they know there's an American citizen coming straight out of university. And what they do is they will put video cameras in your hotel and bugs in your hotel and video cameras in your bedroom. They know whatever they capture can be blackmail material 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the track. Let's say I become involved in US business or politics, then they have something on you. And they did this for everyone that they could. It didn't matter if you're important. It was better if you weren't. You might be young. You might be important 30, 40 years down the track. So everyone, all these Westerners were taped and bugged. And then let's say 40 years later I'm high up in some level of American business and the Russians want something from me. They come knocking on your door with a videotape or recording and say, we need something from you. They're experts at blackmail. So when you consider 2019, this is November 9. When was Donald Trump elected President of the United States? What day? November 9, 3 years to the day. One of the things under investigation, one of the things that the Americans are investigating is whether or not Russia has blackmail material on Donald Trump. And the reason that they think he might do is that some of their spies within the Russian government said that Donald Trump spent a night in a hotel with Russian women and that night some things happened that we won't describe. But on that night, that hotel room was recorded. It's the only night that year, in those years, I can find that Donald Trump was even in Moscow. And what night was that? November 9, 2013, 3 years to the day. This is blackmail material. Very good sources. Good sources through only one night. The only night. He didn't stay in Russia the night before or the night after. It's the only night he was in Russia. And in that night he was in a Russian hotel. And if he was in a Russian hotel and he's an American billionaire, that hotel was bugged. The only thing you have to wonder is what is on those tapes. And very good sources from both British intelligence with sources to Russian intelligence say that there's things on those tapes that are worthy of blackmail. 3 years to the day he's elected, 3 years to the day takes us to the date that we're already considering. So when we consider what Vladimir Putin has been doing in secret, we know that whatever is released in 2019 is not damaging to him, it's damaging to the King of the North. I want to halve a couple of other years, and I'm going to do this quickly because we might run a little short on time. This is 1909. We halve the 220. The 110. The last conference Ellen White participated at. I would suggest that in your time you read some of the statements she made at that general conference. She says, "To us as God's servants has been entrusted the third angel's message." This is the binding off message. That is to prepare a people for the coming of our King. Time is short. Mrs. White solemnly charged the brethren who had come to the meeting as representatives of the cause of present truth from every part of Europe, from Asia, Africa, South America, Australasia, and the islands of the sea, to prepare their hearts for terrible scenes of strife and oppression beyond anything they had conceived of, soon to be witnessed among the nations of the earth. I have it on information. Brother Tony, I think, can clarify if I have it wrong, that the islands of the sea in Fiji was represented represented in the 1909 General Conference. Is that correct? They were there. Very soon, she declared, the strife and oppression of foreign nations will break forth with an intensity that you do not now anticipate. You need to realize the importance of becoming acquainted with God in prayer. That is her message at that General Conference session. We have the 490, halving the 490, takes us to a period of history that we're going to consider more closely. 1774. 1774 was the first Continental Congress. This was the beginning seed of the US government. And from beginning. In 1774, Benjamin Franklin convinced the colonies to form one representative body, the First Continental Congress. This was anticipation of the American Revolution with England that we will soon consider. The earliest beginnings of US government. And we know that we have the 30. It takes us to 2004. The beginning of the laying of the foundations of this movement. Which takes us back to our line of construction. This is not new information. The beginning of the laying of the foundations of that construction marked as 2004. So this is how we can understand 2019 as a year in history. But what it does for us is it introduces a day. I want us then to consider November 9 and this concept of revolution or civil war. This is where we need to remember this morning's study, where we see that between 9/11 and raffia is a symbol of a revolution or a civil war. For the rest of tonight, I'm just going to call it revolution. Revolution and civil war are interchangeable terms. To try and not sound confusing, I'm just going to say that you can mark revolution between 9/11 and the Battle of Raffia, from the beginning of the Patriot Act to the setting up of a dictatorship, this overturning of how the government of the United States functions, the bringing in of a dictator. I want you to read a magazine article from Time magazine 2016, just after Donald Trump's election. This is from Time magazine and it's titled Donald Trump and the 9th of November. It was on the very early morning of November 9, 2016 that Donald Trump secured his historic election to the presidency of the United States. A number of commentators pointed out that November 9 was the anniversary of the Night of Broken Glass, here marked. The anti-Jewish pogrom that erupted in Germany in 1938. And one recent article on German reaction added that it was also the anniversary of the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall, here marked. But November 9 also has another meaning in German history. The events of November 9, 1918 were more important in a sense than either the fall of the wall or the night of broken glass, since the events of November 9, 1918 led to both of these other events. What they've done is they've tied Donald Trump to the 9th of November and then the 9th of November to 3 massive waymarks in German history. November 9 in Germany is still known today as the Day of Fate. And they have a particular word in German to describe November 9, just by the fact that it continually comes up in their history. In fact, they refused to celebrate that day as a waymark in the end of World War I because they have just had so many horrific events on that day, they choose not to recognize it. As they said, the events of November 9, 1918 made possible our other two dates. On that day, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne of Germany, clearing the way for the armistice with the Allies, the Versailles Treaty, the foundation of the Weimar Republic, nearly 15 years of political and economic chaos, finally bringing about Hitler's seizure of power in 1933. So November 9, 1918, the Kaiser of Germany steps down. This was asked by the Allies. They would not agree to an end to World War I until he stepped down. He steps down. 2 days later, World War I ends. This is the armistice. The next year it formally ends with the Treaty of Versailles. Then Germany goes through about 15 years of turmoil. And then, because of those events, Hitler rises to power. From 1871 to 1914, the German Empire had governed Germany very effectively under the Kaisers. Its dissolution represented the end of an era. Donald Trump's election, a victory over the establishment of both the Democrat and the Republican parties, also represents the death of an old order, and we do not know what will replace it. They go on to describe Germany from its founding in 1871 under Bismarck through a series of wars and into World War I. They're just giving you a very good history of Germany. And then it describes World War I. It compares the situation in Germany to the situation in the United States and shows how they were in very similar circumstances. Eventually, in the first week of November, the government of Germany had no choice but to accept conditions that would leave Germany totally at the Allies' mercy. Mutinies broke out in the German fleet and spread in the army. A small communist party hoped to repeat Lenin's success in Russia in Germany. So now you have communists in Germany hoping to take over government. The opposition parties demanded that the Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm abdicate. He agrees to do that on November 9. 2 days later, new civilian leadership accepted the armistice. 7 months after that, it was forced to accept the Treaty of Versailles, destroying its prestige in the eyes of the people. In the 14 years after the fall of the German Empire, the abdication of the Kaiser, no political leader managed to bring them into unity until Hitler in 1933. I just want to map some of this. We understand already that 1789 to 1799 is the French Revolution. its midpoint as 2014, 1794. This was a 220 that took you to 2014. And then we were able to recognise that 1789 also was April 19 or 9/11. And this is revolution. Sorry, I'm going to need all of the board. It culminated with the setting up of Napoleon, the establishment of a dictator. Then we looked this morning at the American Civil War. And we saw that began in 1861 to 1865. We saw that it was the death of a dictator. We marked the midpoint, 1863. It's a waymark, both internal and external, with the 151 that took us to 2014. This again, time period of revolution. We will call this the Civil War. The Civil War in the United States. Now, if we consider the German Revolution, what this paper is about to describe. Also marking the end of the French Revolution, November 9. This article in Time magazine concludes with a statement, "Our own 9th of November, like the German one 98 years ago, is both an end and a beginning. Our future is equally uncertain." What this article does is tying together the election of Donald Trump and the German Revolution. But this is a worldly source. They only have the ability of hindsight. They do not have prophetic foresight. So when they say November 9, 2016, I would like to suggest November 9, 2019. When does the revolution occur? When does it end? 2016 or 2019? Not until you have a dictator, and that's 2019. November 1918 was a society in revolution. So let's consider the German Revolution that brought about the abdication of the Kaiser. By the fall of 1918, the military leaders of Germany knew that they could not win World War I. In hopes of gaining more favourable terms when they surrendered to the Allies, German generals ordered that they form a new German government that was more democratic than the monarchy that had existed under the Kaiser. But the liberal, the leader in Germany, Prince Max von Baden, was unable to control the navy, who began to mutiny. So they know that they cannot win World War I. Despite knowing they cannot win, one of the many foolish decisions Germany made during the war was try to force their navy to fight. And if the German navy, with a war that was already lost, was to go against the British Navy, which was much, much stronger, it was a suicide mission. They would have been mowed down. And those German sailors begin to revolt. They refuse to sail those ships against the British. And that revolution begins on the 30th of October 1918. When the sailors mutiny. First Kiel, these are German cities. First Kiel, then Munich, Hanover, Hamburg, the Rhineland, and the capital Berlin. On November 9th of 1918, Berlin workers left the factories and marched in their thousands from north, south and east to the centre of Berlin. Old grey men and women who had stood for years at the munitions benches. Men invalided out of the army who'd been injured. Boys who had taken over their work of their fathers. The processions were joined by men on leave, war widows, wounded soldiers, students and solid citizens. This uprising had not been arranged by any one leader. The procession marched on in silence. There was no singing and no rejoicing. It came to a standstill before the gates of the Makorfa barracks. The gates of the barracks were barred and the rifles and machine guns threatened from every window to shoot on the crowd. But would the soldiers shoot? Those soldiers were the brothers of the rugged, starving crowds that gathered around the barracks. They flung down their weapons, the gates were opened, and the people streamed into the barracks and joined forces with the Kaiser's army. The ruling power gave in without a struggle and the officers surrendered. As a result of this revolution and unrest, Kaiser Wilhelm and other leaders of the German government abdicated or gave up their power and fled the country. So on the 30th of October 1918, the sailors mutiny. And on November 9, 1918, the Kaiser abdicates. This is the end of the monarchy in Germany. A German newspaper wrote on November 10, the following day, it summed up the events of the day before. It said, yesterday morning, the morning of November 9, everything was still there. The Kaiser, the Chancellor, the Chief of Police. Yesterday afternoon, nothing of all that existed any longer. There was a change in government after the revolution, government of Germany. But what it marked then was a titanic struggle. Who would govern Germany now that the Kaiser had stepped down? The war was over, the German Empire had fallen, and now the question was whether Germany could create a new future and what kind of society it would become. Note the effect on Hitler on that day, how he describes it in his autobiography. Hitler wrote his autobiography and described his feelings of that day when the Kaiser abdicated, when he first heard, when he stood up, when the message was brought in, and he and the other soldiers he fought in World War I were told that the Kaiser had abdicated. They knew then that World War I was lost to Germany. Hitler writes in his autobiography his feelings of hearing that. And he uses the biblical language of Jesus on the cross to describe his agony, his sense of betrayal. He says, this man, destined to eternal night, he's describing himself, who during this hour endured crucifixion on pitiless Calvary, who suffered in body and soul, one of the most wretched from among this crowd of broken heroes. This man's eyes shall be opened, calm shall be restored to his convulsed features. In the ecstasy that is only granted to the dying seer, his dead eyes shall be filled with new light, new splendor, new life. Adolf Hitler knew how to speak. He also knew how to control his people based on emotion. And one of the main ways he chose to do this was to write his history in this context of seeing himself pretty much as Christ, that he died on November 9 and was resurrected with a new vision, this vision of how he was going to restore Germany and save Germany. Whether or not he ever actually had any of those feelings on that day was irrelevant. This was the story he needed to paint of himself to create a cult of personality. He describes that he threw himself onto his bed and clawed himself through an exhausting, emotional 24 hours in which he describes that he died, quote, died and was resurrected as a politician. All of his autobiography, Mein Kampf, is a build-up to this epiphany moment when he sees himself as Germany's saviour and begins his political path, hence comparing himself to Christ. And when he compares himself to Christ, his death and resurrection was November 9, 1918. This is when he claims to have set out on his path to save Germany. I don't want to write it there. This is the reason, this day is the reason that you find the Night of Broken Glass on November 9. Because Hitler used this day every year after he began his climb to power as a day when the public was stirred at the memories of World War I. He used it to drive his ideology. In 1927, Alfred Rosenberg, who was Hitler's chief ideologue, wrote down Hitler's story of the two November 9s. There were two November 9s. First 1918, and then the night when Hitler tried to take power by a military coup. That was also November 9, I think 1923. And these two November 9s were written into a narrative that formed the backbone of Nazi propaganda for the next 20 years. This is when the November 9 began to be known as Germany's Day of Fate, known as the Schicksalstag in German. In 1938, Goebbels deliberately organised the Night of Broken Glass on November 9 to showcase the Nazis' belief that the Jews had stabbed Germans in the back by surrendering in World War I on November 9. Hitler blamed the Jews for the loss of World War I, so the Night of Broken Glass was planned revenge. November 9, 1923, he tries to take power in a military coup, but fails. He was trying to model himself after Mussolini's march on Rome, Mussolini taking power in a military coup. November 9 was then declared as a national holiday during the years of Nazi rule. So November 9 in this history marks the death of a dictator, his abdication, but also the rise of another. One regime ends while another, bruised and battered, has its moment of epiphany. But this is just phase 1 in German history. This is the German Revolution. But after this event, the abdication of the Kaiser, Germany had a very weak government. A weak government. So it goes from revolution into fighting over what the government was now to look like. And from 1918 through to the early months of 1919, all of these opposing forces prepared for this counter-revolution. On January the 5th, 1919, you find counter-revolution. They were known as the Spartacists and also the Communists. Hundreds of armed industrial workers and unionists attempted an armed takeover of Berlin. They seized critical points around the capital, telegraph offices, police stations, government buildings, and the SPD headquarters were all occupied. They barricaded or manned checkpoints on key roads and intersections. A general strike was called. In the first few days of the revolution, these Spartacists won most of their street fights and managed to paralyze significant areas of Berlin. Meanwhile, the new government was building up political and military support to resist this revolution. So from November 9, 1918, these opposing forces that want to seize the new government go into preparation, and then you find a period of counter-revolution. This went from the 5th of January through the month of May. Beginning of January to May the same year. This is the history of the German Revolution. The other major revolution we want to consider is the French Revolution. The Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution in 1917 under the Bolsheviks. Also, flowing out of World War I, it began on the 8th of March 1917. On the 8th of March 1917, thousands of people took to the streets in Russia demanding an end to World War I and bread to feed their starving families. There were mass strikes across the country. The revolution continued for 8 months until what is known as Red October. So beginning in March 8 of 1917, it continues for, they say, 8 months till the same year. And the revolution, where that revolution culminates, is known as Red October, the Bolshevik Revolution, when Lenin seizes power. It's described as the October Revolution, but did it actually occur in October? It wasn't until the following year that Russia adopted the Gregorian calendar, which was already being used across Western Europe. The US changed to the Gregorian calendar in the middle of the 1700s, but Russia had not kept up, and it did not change its calendar until 1918. Russia was one of the last countries in the world to change from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. So when did the October Revolution actually take place, based on our calendar? November 8. November 8, the Bolsheviks storm the Winter Palace and Lenin takes government. November 8, you see Lenin. But is Lenin actually a dictator? At that stage, I would suggest not. What makes Lenin a dictator? I would suggest it's the events of November 9. We've described it already a few times. What's the first step to establishing a dictatorship? Take down a free press. And November 9 of 1917, Lenin releases the decree on the press. I will read it to you. and see if any of it sounds familiar to the speeches of Donald Trump today. He says, in the trying critical period of the revolution and the days that immediately followed it, this is Lenin speaking, the Provisional Revolutionary Committee is compelled to take a number of measures against the counter-revolutionary press of different shades. So he's saying that we are the revolutionaries and the press is the counter-revolution. Immediately outcries were heard from all sides that a new socialist power, the Communist Bolshevik Party, had violated a fundamental principle of its program by encroaching upon the freedom of the press. The workers' and peasants' government, this is what they called them, the Bolsheviks called themselves, calls the attention of the population to the fact that what this liberal facade actually conceals is freedom for the propertied classes, having taken hold of the lion's share of the entire press to poison unhindered the minds and obscure the consciousness of the masses. Everyone knows that the bourgeois wealthy press is one of the most powerful weapons of the wealthy, especially at the crucial moment when this new power, the power of the people, is only affirming itself. It was impossible to leave this weapon wholly in the hands of the enemy, for in such moments it is no less dangerous than bombs and machine guns. That is why temporary, extraordinary measures are taken to stem the torrent of filth and slander in which the press would be only too glad to drown the recent victory of the common people. As soon as the new order becomes consolidated, all administrative pressure on the press will be terminated and it will be granted complete freedom within the bounds of legal responsibility in keeping with a law that will be broadest and most progressive in this respect. However, being aware that a restriction of the press, even at critical moments, is permissible only within the limits of what is absolutely necessary. The general provisions of the press. 1. Only those publications can be suppressed which call for open resistance or insubordination to the new government. 2. Sow sedition through demonstrably slanderous distortion of facts. What do you call demonstrably slanderous distortion of facts in 2000 when you don't like big words? You call that fake news. Instigate actions of an obviously criminal or criminally punishable nature. He says the present ordinance is of a temporary nature and will be repealed by special decree as soon as normal conditions of social life set in. The decree on the press was never abolished, and Russia did not have a free press until around 1991, and they did not have it very long. It was the very first thing that Vladimir Putin got rid of when he was elected to government. So I would suggest that Lenin becomes a dictator, placed in government on November 8, a dictator on November 9 of 1917. Note that this is in the Julian calendar. What date? The 27th of October. The number 27 will continue to have more significance for this movement. After this date, you have a period of preparation. Not everyone is happy with the Bolsheviks taking power. November and December of 1917 saw the consolidation and rise of the White Army. Certain generals opposed to the Bolsheviks started forming together. These were all different parties with split different beliefs, but they begin to come together to oppose this new dictatorship. And they begin in 1918. Beginning counter-revolution. And Russia was engulfed in a horrific counter-revolution from 1918 through to 1922. If you look for it in history books, it's known as first the Russian Revolution and then the Russian Civil War. This is seen as the German Revolution and then the German Civil War. But to illustrate our point, I want to describe these first as revolution and then a counter-revolution against the new government, against the new dictatorship. From November 17 through the spring of 1918 and even beyond, those who would fight in this Russian Civil War counter-revolution began to take sides. They were split on much of their social status and on their beliefs, but they were united only through their opposition to Bolshevism. And this is known as the White Terror. The Bolsheviks, the communists, were the Reds. We discussed red as a symbol of communism. So these were the Whites. And this was the White Terror. Both sides committing horrific atrocities. 1922 marks the creation of the Soviet Union. At the end of this second revolutionary period. We haven't discussed what really happened in 1794 as it applies. So what I would like to suggest is that just like in this history we find revolution and counter-revolution, if we take the French Revolution and divide it in half, we see that it was 5 years of revolution and 5 years of counter-revolution. So I want us to consider a secondary application for the French Revolution. This is a secondary application, acknowledging that it comes in two phases. The French Revolution began in 1789. And from 1789 through to 1794 was the French Revolution under the Jacobins. This was the Jacobins under a man known as Robespierre. They overthrew the monarchy and implemented a reign of terror. Guillotining any and all opposition and even many of their own. In their efforts to remove God entirely from their society, they introduced a 10-day week and a totally new calendar known as the French Revolutionary Calendar. They introduced that calendar in 1793 through to a few years after the revolution ended in 1799. So from 1789 to 1794, it's the Jacobins under Robespierre undertaking this reign of terror, and the numbers of the people that they guillotined for only being suspected of having opinions differing to the Jacobins. They killed so many people for so foolish reasons. The reign of terror ended on the 27th of July, 1794. Note the number 27. 27th of July, 1794, when Robespierre and his associates were overthrown. However, there was not an immediate reaction to his rule, and for many months an unstable political climate prevailed before a new order emerged. It took time for Jacobin clubs to be outlawed, separate rebellions crushed, and a full-scale counter-revolution against the Jacobins to be launched. That preparation, 1794 to 1795. This is preparation. But as we discussed, France was in this period not using this calendar. They were using a new calendar, the French Revolutionary calendar. What day is the 27th of July in the French Revolutionary calendar? They had whole new months, whole new days. It's known as the 9th of Thermidor, year 2 of the Revolutionary calendar. The 9th of Thermidor is the same as the 27th of July, the 9th of Thermidor being in their new calendar that they'd created to remove God from the face of society. What month is Thermidor in the Revolutionary calendar? It's the 11th month. The 9th day of the 11th month in the Revolutionary calendar is when Robespierre and the Jacobins are toppled. They tried so hard to remove God from society, from even their days of the week, and from the calendar itself. But these people who wrote that calendar, the day they fall is the right day on their calendar for God to mark an event. You can't remove God. He signed it. He signed their fall with their own calendar. The 9th day of the 11th month, November 9 in their revolutionary calendar. Then you see a period of preparation, and then you see a counter-revolution. 1795 to 1799. And this was also known as the White Terror. The Reign of Terror, and then the White Terror. The White Terror took place in 1794 during the period known as the Thermidorian reaction, Thermidor being their 11th month, the reaction to the 11th month. It was organised by royalist forces, those who'd been loyal to the monarchy that the Jacobins had killed. And it targeted Jacobins and anyone suspected of supporting them. Through France, both real and suspected Jacobins were attacked and often murdered. Just as during the Reign of Terror, trials were held with little regard for due process. And again, many massacres occurred. Gangs were formed of hired murderers who went by the name Company of Jesus or Company of the Sun. And they roamed the streets killing any Jacobins that they could find. So what you find first, a period of revolution that ends on a date that can be marked as November 9 in our calendar, a period of preparation taking you into the next year, and then the launch of a counter-revolution against a new government. So when we bring that down to our history, where did it begin? So at 9/11 we see the beginning of the overturning of the US government under the Patriot Act. That first revolution takes us to our close of probation, November 9 of 2019. And then we should expect to see a period of preparation and a counter-revolution from November 9, 2019 takes us to 2020, and a counter-revolution against a new dictatorship, the dictatorship of Donald Trump. I want to mark a couple of other November 9s in history. When we consider the United States as the glorious land, the Mayflower Pilgrims, those first pilgrims who, just like Revelation tells us, fled from the mouth of the dragon to the United States to escape the flood. They first sighted the glorious land on November 9. On November 9, 1620, the Pilgrims first laid eyes on the United States, and on November 11, they signed the Mayflower Compact, their first type of constitution. The compact is known as the germ of American government. So I'll leave this study here. This is our study of revolutions. We've looked at the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Civil War, and the French Revolution in two separate applications. We've noted the similarities, that they join at this midway point, and here we can recognize where it ties into our study of 2019 and November 9, and what we should expect to see come out of this rising up of Donald Trump as a dictator. I would like to include one other thought just before we close. Do you mind if I rub this out? Is it okay? We'll just need a little bit of space. And this is considering something else that we haven't brought in. We've brought all these revolutions into our history, but we have not yet considered the American Revolution. If we consider the 245, it took us back to 1774, it's still on the board, and the First Continental Congress. Why was the First Continental Congress created? Because there was a beginning, there had been building for some time tension between the United States and who was still their government, and that was the British Empire. These are the years we should mark. 1773 was the Boston Tea Party. 1774, the First Continental Congress, the beginning of US government. 1775 was the beginning of the American Revolution. It began on what day? April 19. That will have significance for us. And it began at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We're going to discuss this more tomorrow morning. 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, where they formally split from the British Empire in the early years of the American Revolution. When we halved the 490 and did the 245, it took us back to 1774. And what did we say 1774 was? 1774, we could do it this way, with the 245, takes us to 2019. But I'll drop them down so that we can see it on a line. 1774, the beginning of US government, then we see the end of a democratic US government. 2019, when then does the American Revolution start? 2020. It's another logic to take us to the same place, that 2020 marks the beginning of a counter-revolution. This is the United States against the British, who was at that time their government. By the way, how many soldiers died in the Battle of Lexington and Concord? British casualties in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. 273. That's the number that began our journey into studying these things to begin with, the number 273. 1776, marking the Declaration of Independence. You see it swelling in 1773. This is over imports and taxation. 1774, beginning of US government. 1775, beginning of revolution. 2020 marks the beginning of the counter-revolution against Donald Trump's dictatorship. It's also 1773, you see the Jesuit order abolished. And we can... Sorry? 25 years before 1798 and the deadly wound. You can consider 1773 and the abolishment of the Jesuit order. Taking it to this year, I would suggest that has implications for what we expect to see in the papacy. We've described its condition and its state of internal civil war. We are currently in the time period of our loud cry. These symbols are interchangeable, loud cry and midnight cry. And what is midnight cry? For the Millerites. Midnight cry equals August 15. In the time period of August 15, what the papacy used to resurrect itself was the messages of Fatima. Fatima is a message of Mary. And when is Mary's feast day? August 15. It has been for over 1,000 years. You can tie Mary into this time period. And I would suggest that has implications for the resurrection of the papacy that we know we are expecting to see. If you don't mind, we will close in prayer, and then I believe there will be questions. This is all that we had for today. If you can make it to tomorrow morning, I want to consider more the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and we're going to finish up by tying a few of those things together. If you'll kneel with me in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for all of our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that you see the end from the beginning, that you then tell us the end from the beginning, that you don't leave your much-loved people in doubt of what is going on in the world around us. We know, Lord, that while your church sleeps, that people, worldly people all over the world are saying, this is World War II. This is the beginning of World War III. This is the end of the United States as a leader of democracy in the world. They can see that Donald Trump is the last president of the United States. They can see that the world is ending, Lord, and they're afraid that you don't leave your beloved people, Lord, to be afraid because we don't know what's going on. Father, you're going to tell us what's going on. Thank you, Lord, for what you've already revealed. I pray, Lord, that we'll be established in these truths, that those of us who these things are new to will be inspired to go back and trace the prophetic messages that you have introduced into this movement, Lord, that you will have a people ready with a message to reach the world, to explain to them what is happening, that Sunday law is approaching and you are coming back to take your faithful home. Thank you for your Sabbath hours and the fact that we've been able to enjoy them together as a community. I pray this prayer in Jesus' holy name. Amen.